This is before we started going together. Just after Christmas, Robert's senior year, Ellie Engstrom came knocking on the Johnson's door, claiming that she was carrying Robert's baby. I was just a freshman, but even I heard how she told the Johnsons that she'd been seeing Robert on the sly. These days, plenty of girls have babies on their own. Nobody seems to think a whole lot about it. But this was 1962. Pregnant girl's only hope was a quick wedding. But Robert laughed in her face. Said how she'd been with half the football team. How could he know whose child it was? Mrs. Johnson and Ellie Packin said that if Ellie thought she was going to catch herself a rich husband with that old trick, she had another thing coming. And Robert's father, well, I am sure, like always, he hid behind his newspaper. You see, the Johnsons have been in Kentucky since before the Civil War. Biggest tobacco farmers in Harlan County. Always have been. Who was going to believe a poor girl who lived in an old silver travel trailer with her half-crazy grandma who went around telling people that the Russian premier, Nikita Khrushchev, was the Antichrist? Once the whispering started, Ellie pretty much stayed to herself. She tried to finish school. I mean, after all, she was secretary of the Honor Society. When the baby started to show, the principal called her in the office and said there was a rule against pregnant girls. He expelled her 5 weeks before graduation. She lost her job down at the rec hall, too. When Grandma Engstrom found out, she drug Ellie down to the First Assembly of God Church, where she was head of the deaconesses, marched her right up the aisle, made her stand in front and confess her sins to the entire congregation. Barbara Hollis was there that day, and she said Ellie was shaking and crying so hard you could hardly understand the words she said. Barbara said all the elders gathered around her, and they laid hands on her, and they prayed and prayed that she'd be healed of her evil ways. I guess Grandma Engstrom thought that prayer didn't take, because about a month before the baby was due, she put Ellie out on the street. My mother was driving up to the post office, and she saw Ellie standing on the corner of 3rd and Maple, just looking off into the distance, a beat-up suitcase right beside her. Nobody knew where she went. To tell you the truth, I don't think there was one person who wanted to find out, who even cared enough. When Grandma Engstrom died the next winter, she'd had heart trouble a long time. Ellie didn't come home for the funeral, and the talk started up all over again, but it died down soon enough, like talk does. Before the end of the next school year, Robert and I were going steady. Oh, I asked him about Ellie's baby before I take his ring. He swore to me that she was lying. He swore to me that there was no way the child was his. I guess more than anything, I wanted to believe him. We were married June 5th, 1964, 2 days after I graduated from high school. We moved into this little house across from his parents, and I stayed real busy for a while, painting walls, hanging curtains, planting flowers in the yard. Probably sounds silly or old-fashioned these days, but I thought my dreams had come true. Ever since I was just in grade school, all I ever really wanted was just a little house of my own and some babies to raise. But the babies never came. Oh, I didn't worry at first. We were young. We had plenty of time. My best friend, Amy Anderson, had twins, James and John. White blonde hair as soft as cotton and no telling them apart. I couldn't believe it when she wanted to go back to work right away. But I was sure glad to take care of them. It was kind of like having my own, till the end of the day when Amy came to take them home. Then the house would seem so silent and empty, except for the sound of the television. Then, just before the boys were going to start first grade, their father got transferred to Louisville. I cried and cried until Robert finally said, "Enough is enough." And that's when I got to thinking. His mother was always bragging that Robert was an answer to prayer. So I started going to church. I thought maybe if I was a better person that Jesus would give me a baby of my own. But the years passed and nothing happened. And then, one night, right after our 10th wedding anniversary, Robert was out in the field and I was fixing dinner when the phone rang. At first, nobody spoke. And then a boy's voice came, high and shaky. Hello? Hello? This is Robert Allen, Jr. I just stared at the phone, my heart pounded in my throat. All I could think about was Ella Engstrom and that pretty freckled face and that long pale hair, and there I was in a dirty apron, sweating in the heat. I hung the phone up real quiet, and that night I prayed. I prayed that the boy wouldn't call back. Well, by Sunday morning I was nearly sick with keeping that secret. I told Robert I had a stomachache and I better not go to church, but he just snorted and said, "What are you talking about? My mother's going to be here any minute." Well, it's a good saying Mrs. Johnson's always been a talker, because all the way to town I didn't have to say much at all, except, yes'm, is that so? Well, that Sunday morning, of all things, the scripture was the 21st chapter of Genesis. The story of Abraham and Sarah, who was barren. I remember Mr. Royal was the reader that morning, his voice as rich and deep as when he taught us Shakespeare in sophomore English. He read how Abraham and Sarah wanted a baby so much that Sarah sent Abraham into Hagar, her slave girl, to have a baby with her. Sort of like surrogate mother. They did that back in Bible times. But when the baby comes, Sarah gets mean and jealous and spiteful. And she tells Abraham to send Hagar and the child out to the desert. And worst of all, he doesn't, even though it's his very own son. When Pastor Miller began to preach, I just kept thinking about Sarah, how desperate she was to have a baby just like me. But then, I thought about Hagar, a slave girl all her life, nobody she could count on, nobody she could turn to, and then sent off with her own baby to a place where nothing waited but death under a hot desert sky. All I could think about was a 16-year-old girl, alone on a corner, looking down the road at nothing. That night, when Robert was over at his parents', the phone rang again. I sat there holding the phone so tight my fingers hurt while the boy told me that his mother was sick, that she had cancer. He said that she wanted to talk to me. Would I come? I went the very next Friday. I drove up to Lexington, and then I followed the boy's directions to a little white house on the edge of town. The yard was kept up real neat with yellow roses on a trellis right next to the porch, where a boy with a freckled face and pale hair sat in the swing, pushing it back and forth with his toes. I knew he had to be 10 or 11, but he just looked so young and so scared. "You're Robert?" I said. He just nodded and opened the screen door. Ella Engstrom lay on the couch, and I wouldn't have recognized her. Her prettiness was all gone with the cancer. Her face was drawn and thin, and her hair was patchy from chemo. When she sent the boy outside, her voice wasn't much more than a whisper. And then she turned to me. "Sharon," she said, "I want you to take my son." And me? No, I never did get pregnant. But when Robert Jr. was 14, we adopted Charles and Billy Ray, brothers from Louisville who'd had a real rough start in life. You know, it's easy enough to give in to jealousy and envy and resentment. I've done it enough in my own life. But you know, the thing
You can't ever go